Hi, my name's Krista. Today we are doing the third episode of our Female Founders in Web3 series for Bitcoin Bay. And I'm having a chat to Amber Scott, who is the founder of Outliers, which is a compliance consultancy with a specialization in crypto. So she's going to talk to us about her journey and background in compliance and how she ended up then learning about crypto and combining that with her compliance expertise to found Outliers. With that, I'm going to hand over to Amber. If you could introduce yourself, and then I've got a whole bunch of questions I'm dying to ask you.
Hi, I'm Amber Scott, and I'm the founder and CEO at Outlier Compliance Group.
So thank you very much for the intro. As I said, we're talking about you today specifically as a female founder in Web3, but it would be interesting to get your background in compliance and your journey there first, because that's obviously kind of where you've come from, and then you've headed into a crypto world somewhat by happenstance, I feel like. But if you could talk a little bit about why you ended up doing compliance in the first place and what that journey was like, that would be great.
Absolutely, and I think these things have some elements in common, which are that they were both things that were really fascinating to me, that when I happened upon them, I decided that these were areas that I wanted to work in and that I would continue doing this until it stopped being interesting. And neither one of these things has stopped being interesting. In fact, they're still very much fascinating and engaging to me. I started in compliance in 2001 at Manulife, and I, with all of the wonderful bravado of someone with a newly minted undergraduate degree, looked at a job description and said, this sounds quite interesting. And I'm certain that although I don't have any of the hard skills, I can learn those things. And I of course have all the soft skills because I'm such a lovely person. And for whatever reason, someone hired me despite that being my tack. And I started working in compliance in Manulife. I started there in August of 2001. And in September of 2001, September 11th happened. And everything about the conversation surrounding anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing changed. So suddenly we had these things that were very serious. We had a lot of new laws and regulations coming into play. No one was really sure what we had to do to comply with them or what was changing. And it was fascinating. It was an exciting area to work in. And so I really grew up in terms of Canadian compliance with the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act coming into play and coming into force in its various phases and iterations as someone working in compliance in the financial sector. It's never been boring.
I can empathize with that. What was it specifically about compliance that you enjoyed, like with the day-to-day of what you're doing? What is it that you find fascinating?
I really like solving problems. And I know that there are probably some business people crossing their arms and saying, doesn't compliance cause all the problems? But the way that I see it, we're all on the same side. We want businesses to succeed. We don't want crimes to perpetuate themselves. And really, the things that I'm doing are figuring out the ways that business can manage its risk, that they can succeed within certain regulatory and legal environments. And so really the nitty-gritty of how do we play in that sandbox, how do we make it work within the context of the rule set that we're given?
Yeah, that makes sense. So how did you get involved in crypto? Can you talk about your crypto journey, like when it started and how it started?
Absolutely. I founded Outlier in 2013. And shortly after that, a friend and colleague who was doing payment processing at the time called me and asked for some help in updating his risk assessment. And at that point in time, he had started doing a lot of processing for a Bitcoin exchange, and that had turned into a lot of his volume. And so we talked about it, and I said, look, I haven't transacted with Bitcoin. I've read about it in Wired. I'm tangentially aware of it. I'm very leery of it. I had understood some previous things that had happened with things like Liberty Reserve, where there had been actual money laundering charges laid. And so I was very skeptical at the outset as a compliance geek about Bitcoin and about what would emerge as this whole virtual currency sector. And so being that I don't understand things until I can play with it, I asked if he could pay my retainer in Bitcoin. And he said, sure, I'm going to send you a couple of articles. I need you to read these things. You're going to need to set up something called a wallet. how are your coding skills? And I said, they're rusty. I haven't really touched that since, a whole lot since I was an undergrad at the University of Waterloo. And he said, okay, I can't help you set it up because it will cause a security issue for you if I know what your private keys are. And I said, what's a private key? This is all in these articles. So he sends me a bunch of articles. I start reading them on
So wait a
Thursday
second,
night.
what year was this?
This was 2013. So everything is in command line.
I was going to say, because there were seed phrases didn't exist then, right?
I think there were some early iterations of things, but nothing was friendly. There was no nice like GUIs, so no graphical user interface really to speak of. And when there was, it was clunky and difficult to use. So yeah, it was a very different. And for what it's worth, if you're working on Bitcoin and crypto and Web3 today, please think of user interface. So think of UI, UX. I think that's some of the most valuable things that we can do, and really so important to the overall success of a lot of these tools that exist. The average person has to be able to use them, and they have to be able to use them in a way that's secure. And that's one of the trade-offs that we still find today, where there's something that's maybe user-friendly, but it isn't as secure as something else that's less user-friendly. And so it's still something that we navigate, although it's become much better than it was then. I stayed up and reading these articles. I ended up staying up way too late. I missed a meeting the next day because I just woke up, and I was so frustrated with some of what I was reading. It was this idea that there's this pseudonymous founder, which seemed absolutely shady to me. Like, who is this Satoshi Nakamoto? Surely someone knows who this is. The idea of the 21 million hard cap just seemed absolutely baffling to me from a monetary policy. And I was coming at this having an MBA and having a background in financial services. Then I was just baffled by all of these things, but also really interested. And I think part of that, and I talk about this, I won't go into it very deeply today, but I talk about it a little bit in the Cypherpunk Women's Anthology, that I was coming at it from the perspective of having family members that escaped to Canada as refugees that came with nothing.
Really?
I came from a perspective where when I was younger, I had some family members that were bad actors, and in my first job, said family members just got access to my bank account and drained all the funds that I had earned several times. And I was a minor and they were not, and I had no recourse.
Wow.
And so thinking about those types of things, and I think coming into it with those experiences, the idea that you could hold in your head the access to your wealth, and the idea that you could cross borders with it, the idea that you could take measures on your own, that you could self-custody and protect yourself from bad actors in your environment. And that some of this was so strong, that this encryption is so strong that you could protect yourself from state-sponsored bad actors. Wow. That was really something to me. And so as much as I was incredulous about a lot of the elements that I was seeing, there just seemed to be such an incredible potential for social good in the world overall. And that outweighed anything else that I thought about it at the time.
That's really fascinating, because when I was reading your bio, you've done an absolute stack of volunteer work. I couldn't believe the amount of stuff. I was like, how on earth has she found time for all of this stuff? It was quite insane. So it's interesting that was a hook for you, was the social good. Because I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Alex Gladstein, the human rights activist. He's a huge Bitcoin proponent, and I love his work. But I find it really fascinating how Bitcoin kind of unites all of these very diverse people for very diverse reasons. So that's really interesting. I wouldn't have thought that necessarily with a compliance background, that would have been such a strong hook for you.
I think for a lot of people in the compliance world, that's part of why we do what we do. In anti-money laundering, there are really excellent initiatives that relate to human trafficking, terrorist financing, all different sorts of things, and fraud prevention. I think that all of us know someone who've been the victim of a scam at some point in time, if we haven't been a victim ourselves. And frankly, probably more of us than we'd like to admit have actually at one point or another fallen victim to a scam. So the degree to which we can do things that make life better for people, we should be trying to do those. And this is part of that funny balance with compliance, is how do we get it right so that we're protecting people from being victimized, but we're also not making services inaccessible to people who would otherwise want to access those services. And I think it's a fine line, and it's really difficult. And I accept that as one of the very valid criticisms of anti-money laundering generally, that for certain groups of people, and particularly marginalized groups of people, things like present your identification card can be infinitely more complicated than it is for my white middle-class self sitting in this office today.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective on that. And before we dive too much then into what you're doing kind of in the crypto space with Outliers, could you just take a step back and talk about why you founded Outliers? Because you would have been reasonably young at the time when you did that. So that's quite a punchy leap, I feel like.
35. I was 35 when I founded Outlier. And I feel like...
That's young.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, in crypto, I felt relatively old in that I was encountering all of these people that were in their 20s that were just doing absolutely incredible things. And so that's probably a good reminder for me that maybe I wasn't as late to the game as I thought I was. But I think, like most entrepreneurs, the idea for me was really about solving problems. I had been part of a boutique consulting firm that was acquired by a larger consulting firm. Neither one of those things were particularly happy experiences for me in retrospect, but they taught me a lot. And they taught me that I wanted to do things differently. And Outlier was really the genesis of some of those ideas. So the idea that to do consulting, so that to advise other businesses, you should have actually done the thing. So Outlier is named after Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, which has a bunch of really awesome stuff in it. But one of those things is the notion that to really be an expert at something, you need a lot of experience, roughly 10,000 hours. So everyone on our team has 10,000 hours of in-house compliance experience. And that's just part of how we run our business. We've also done some really interesting things in terms of comp model.
So sorry to interrupt you, but so when you started it, that was kind of one of your criteria for hiring, was you have to have your 10,000 hours. Interesting.
Yes. And we've kept it that way, which is occasionally frustrating. We've had moments where we're like, oh, we'd really love to hire this person, and maybe in 5 years we will. Maybe they'll come join us at that point, which is it's difficult, but I think worthwhile to look at things through that lens.
So just in terms of the mechanics of starting your business, for any female founders that are interested, and this isn't a crypto specific question, but what was the first step that you took? Did you stay in full-time employment while you started setting things up, or did you just say, right, I'm going cold, and how did you do it?
No, I talked to my husband at the time, and was basically, I had a chunk of change where I said, look, I'm just going to pay for, we were getting married, and I was like, I'm going to pay for all of the wedding stuff. And then I'm just going to stop paying my half of any of our expenses for 6 months. And I'm going to do this thing. And basically, can you give me like that much runway? And so either by that point, I will be profitable, or maybe I'll consider looking for another job. So can I have 6 months to make this work? And I was really lucky to be able to do that thing. He probably thought I was a little bit crazy, but also fairly employable. So I think if it didn't work, it didn't work. But that was the deal, was that I could just be very focused on that for that period of time. If I could do it over again, I probably would have asked for I probably would have said a year. But I was it's my first business. I didn't know.
And so what did you do then? Now I was going to say, but like, what did you do then? So you presumably like registered a company name. Did you go and get offices? Did you look immediately for people to hire, or like how did you kind of structure things?
So I registered a company name. I updated my LinkedIn. I sent an email out to my immediate contacts. It was just like, hey, here's my new contact information. And I started thinking through really, and I think it had been tumbling in my mind for a long time, because in the context of a larger organization, you always have so many ideas about how you could do this and why don't we do it this way? And I think I could do it better. So I spent at first a lot of time writing about those things, and really writing a lot of content. So content for our website, blog postings, and that's really stayed as one of the main things that we've done from a marketing and client acquisition perspective. We don't do sales, we don't do advertising. We just write the content that we all wish existed. And so when there's that, like, oh, this is really weird and squeegee, and figuring this out is difficult, but we've figured out something that works, we'll put content out about that. And we try to do that continuously because we can. And I think that's probably the biggest piece of advice that I would have for new founders that are solving real problems. Don't be afraid to talk about it. Don't be afraid to give away a little bit of that knowledge, to give a little. That's not your secret sauce. When I think about what I do, I'm interpreting regulation, and I'm putting into place compliance programs that help people comply with regulation. The regulation is public. Anyone can read it. Anyone can know what it is. That's not the secret sauce. It's the problem solving that's the secret sauce. It's figuring out how to do it. It's figuring out how to do it efficiently. And that was really helpful. I think it was helpful for me as well that I had a really good network that I had built up over the years. But even that was really fascinating, because I had left another consulting company. And so as part of that, I was actually very hesitant, even when people reached out to me, to take on people that had been their clients. And so I took a really conservative position, where people that had been my clients with a former company called me, and I would actually sit there on the phone with them and try to help them work through whatever their issues were with that company, so that they could get their project finished with that company instead of taking them on as clients, because I was just so conservative about it. And I mean, we got advice from a law firm that had said, if they're approaching you, and you make sure you get that in writing from them. And so there are probably a lot more times where we could have taken on early clients that we didn't, but I don't regret that either. I think in some of those cases, once you've started a project with a particular firm, it's probably easier and more efficient to finish it out with that firm, as long as you're managing it well. And I think all of those things are what's really built our brand and reputation over the years, that even in cases where maybe there's a different short-term win for me financially, but I don't think that's the right move for the company, we'll sit down and have a talk about that. And I think this is really one of the most interesting things that's happened in terms of companies that are in crypto and companies that are in the Web3 space. We'll get calls from people where they'll say, we're thinking of doing this and this and this and this. And we'll say, okay, but why are you thinking of doing those things? Why do you want to have a token? Why do you want to have a Bitcoin exchange if your primary business is, for instance, that you're successfully selling, online games? And so really, what's the purpose of that thing? And then we've built up a really fantastic network of other folks that we work with. And so there are a number of law firms that we work with, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention my favorite securities lawyer, Laurie Stein, because I've just mentioned that token example. And when someone's saying, I really want to do a token, and it sounds like it's probably a security, she's our first port of call. And I think that's the other piece that's really important. Is to make sure that you know other experts that are working in adjacent areas, that you have a really good others list, that you have good folks that you can refer to and bounce things off of, and work with on solving problems together, because we're all bringing different expertise to that table.
So when you started off, then you had a network, you start writing content, and how did you scale? Like, when did you start hiring other employees? Was it just when you found the workload was becoming a manageable solo?
I think that I've gotten better at that over time. We're such a good team. We're such a close, cohesive team. And I can say unabashedly that I love everyone on our team. And I think that's one of the hardest things, especially at an early stage. You want people that are incredible performers. You want people that believe in your mission. You want people that are going to work hard and bring a lot to the table and essentially act as owners. And so I think that's always a question. It's always a question whenever we scale in terms of how we do that and reaching out to our own networks. I've come to a point where, from a social perspective, I've become a big believer in the idea that we need to make our postings externally rather than just going through our networks. And part of that is making sure that we're reaching all of the potential folks that may be just absolute rock stars that might not be in my immediate network or that we might not know about. Um, and part of that is just making sure that we have diversity of thought. If I'm always hiring people that I know directly, that I'm already friends with, that I already have a history with, I think that I'm really at risk of missing major things in terms, I mean, both in terms of the culture of the company, but also in terms of what I'm building and how I'm solving problems. I'm missing potential solutions and potential ways of thinking about things.
Yeah, that's very
And I
smart.
want
That's
those.
smart. It's hard to do.
It is,
So,
but worthwhile.
100%. Yeah. So to go back to the piece then about crypto. So you started off with this journey with this one client who was interested in essentially transacting in crypto. So you go down your Bitcoin rabbit hole. And then how did that take your business in that direction? Because I think one thing that's quite interesting about your website is it doesn't really say anything specifically about crypto, but you were introduced to me, like when I was, advised to interview you, the label they gave you was one of the biggest experts in crypto in Canada. Compliance experts in crypto in Canada. And so I thought that was really interesting because I thought she's obviously got a very strong brand in the industry. But you don't scream about that on your website. So can you talk a little bit about how this first kind of client converted into a more ongoing business, shall we say, in that space?
Sure. I think a lot of that happened relatively quickly. So that client introduced us to the exchange that he was working with. We ended up coming in and doing some training with the exchange. And at the time, there wasn't anti-money laundering regulation that applied to exchanges, but they were getting a lot of pressure from banks and from other partners to start to put these types of measures in place. And so we built a compliance program for that exchange. We did training with their staff. We spent a lot of time. I can't emphasize this enough because, and in those days and still today, I was very much bringing compliance expertise to the table, but everyone around me was constantly teaching me and training me and helping me to understand the risk parameters, helping me to understand the culture. I spent a lot of times going to meetups, and a huge thank you to Anthony Diorio and to Nancy Wu for putting those on at the time. There was Decentral in Toronto, which was just this brilliant place where folks could go, and there were meetups every week where you could go and learn about crypto. And a lot of the time I would just go and show up and listen and ask people questions about what they were doing and what they were working on, because I was so curious about this culture that was so different from everything else I was seeing. And there were things that I found just from a compliance nerd risk perspective, absolutely absurd. So for instance, when you're signing up for an account for something, you put your name. You don't put loves to throw bricks 6969. Like that's not. So these are things that would be showing up in the name field. I'm looking at it and I'm like, why are we allowing numbers in the name field first? And what is this? And starting to research it and figure that out. And I mean, that's not a real username for what that's worth. But it's an example that I throw out because it's structured a little bit to look like a gamer tag. And that's really the types of things that we were seeing that you just wouldn't see. I mean, no one would put their gamer tag when they were signing up for a bank account unless they had a terrible autofill accident. And so those types of trends were very different. And I think even from the cryptocurrency perspective, that's changed a lot in recent years. So there's really there's been a lot of legislation, but I think there's also been a lot more professionalization generally across the industry.
Yeah, that's very true. Although it is interesting when you talk about the culture. Like the thing I found really interesting about the space was how memes are such an important part of it.
Huge.
It's just, it's like, no, I mean, I was in financial services for 20 years. So for me to come into that kind of environment, I'm like, this is so strange. Oh gosh.
Memes and yeah, accounts with a huge following that are completely pseudonymous.
Yeah, it was actually interesting because I was at Consensus recently and 6529 was speaking there. But speaking meant this huge image of his avatar on the screen, and then he was just calling in on the line, and there was a human on the stage interviewing him. And I just thought, this is like really like the future, which I think actually segues us very nicely into the metaverse. Can you talk a little bit about your journey in the metaverse and where Outliers sits in the metaverse?
So we have an office in the metaverse that's shared with Aaron Greenhouse, so his law firm, and then another company, and so it's a virtual office space that they invited us to be part of, and I think we're the first compliance geeks in in Decentraland, and Aaron was certainly the first law firm there. It's been a really interesting experience so far. I think it's early days. We're figuring out a lot of these things. We're figuring out how regulation applies. And to me, that's really like that first asking for a retainer to be paid in Bitcoin and needing to do Bitcoin transactions, needing to get on exchanges and set up accounts and play and figure out what's actually happening. I think that's very much true of the metaverse. There are these interactions that are happening in completely different contexts than we'd be used to traditionally. And understanding that is important. I would say that that's probably a trend in my career because I got a Facebook account back when it was still called Facebook when I was a banker, because we were not because I cared or understood what any of that was really in 2006, but because we had started to do advertising on this platform and it was getting some traction, but I didn't understand what it was. And I was looking at all of these, hey, can we ask for access to people's friends lists? And I was a privacy officer. And so I'm looking at it and saying, I have to know what that is. And the only way for me to know what that is to play with these systems. And I think that's absolutely true. I would say if you are on the outside with a skill set in law, in compliance, in marketing, in whatever your skill set is, and you're saying, hey, I'd love to become involved in Bitcoin. I'd love to become involved in Web3. I'd love to become involved in one of these techie worlds and I don't understand it. Flip up your laptop and start to play. You just have to interact in order to understand what's actually happening. And there's no better way to do it. And people are always so generous with their time and so happy to explain and teach and help you figure out that context when you're genuinely curious about it. But you have to take that first step.
I found was very notable in the crypto community actually is how welcoming it is. I mean, people talk a lot about the toxicity, but they don't talk a lot about how welcoming it is. And I just found it was, like you say, people are willing to give up huge amounts of their own time just to educate you for the joy of having somebody else know about it, which is quite incredible, really.
One of my favorite Bitcoin Bay memories is that there was, and this is going back quite a few years, to one of the early Bitcoin bull markets. And there was a lad that came in and he had access to his grandparents' $2 million retirement fund. And he wanted to know how to, he was basically saying like, I'm ready, who wants to sell me Bitcoin and how much of this retirement fund should I put into Bitcoin? And he said this very loudly and very openly in this sort of public forum. And you don't know who's there. You don't know, could someone be a scammer? Could someone be a bad actor? And very quickly, some people pulled him aside and said, okay, so let's talk about risk. Let's talk about security. Let's talk about that thing you just did, why you're never going to do that again. So you don't announce this. And do you understand what a wallet is? Do you understand how to secure a wallet? Do you understand Bitcoin as an asset? And really kind of helped him figure those things out. in this context of before anyone will do any kind of transaction with you, because so many of the transactions at that point in time were just peer-to-peer and person to person. It was kind of the idea that before anyone is going to sell you any Bitcoin, we're going to make sure that you understand security, that you're not going to get immediately scammed, or that you're not going to get robbed, that you understand what it is that you're buying. So let's take care of you as a community. And it was just fantastic. I would say that that's not uncommon.
I agree. Can you talk then a little bit about, I'm just curious whether you have any thoughts about this yet, like where do you see the compliance issues coming up in the metaverse? So as we journey into that and people get much more involved and then we see more businesses setting up, do you have any thoughts about what potential issues might arise?
So the trap that I think a lot of folks fall into is the idea that it's so new that it's not possibly regulated. And I think that's always dangerous, because you really have to look at things and say, how are regulators applying existing regulation? Are they applying existing regulation? The other challenge that we see often is the idea that technology is very instant and global. So I can deploy something that's suddenly available in every country instantaneously, but I might be breaking laws in some of those countries by deploying that thing. And so really understanding the nuance of where your audience is and what the context is that applies to that audience. And there are some times where you might decide that taking that risk is worth it. And there are some times when you might not. But I think those pieces are important, understanding the context that applies to the thing that you want to do. And understanding that just because we're saying it's online or it's in the metaverse doesn't mean that it is beyond laws, especially if you have a company, which I think is fairly interesting. And I'm fascinated by this in the context of DEXs, or decentralized exchanges, where you have this idea that, oh, but this thing is decentralized, it's a DEX. It's controlled by 6 people. They're in an office in California. They have an address on their website. All of the pictures are on their website, and you know where the funding came from. And so slapping that decentralized label on it when you still have that ownership and control isn't going to fly with your regulators. And I think understanding that is probably one of the biggest challenges that we see today.
Yeah, for sure.
In the context of decentralization.
So you've done a bit of work already, I think, with female founders in the Web3 space through Crypto Chicks in Toronto. Can you talk a bit about, like, just to give some sense to female founders that want to move into this space, do you have any, I guess, advice on what the best process is to build your business on Web3, why you might want to build on Web3 and what challenges there might be and how to kind of go about it?
I think just
that's like 20 questions wrapped into one.
It's 20 questions, and they're all great questions. And so much of it is just do it. I think one of the most interesting things I've ever heard was from a woman who coached political candidates to get ready for running for office. And she had this list of 10 things. And she said she would have women that had 7 or 8 out of the things. I would say, oh, maybe I should hang back for 4 years and try to check another one off. She's like, no, you're perfect. Go, deploy. And she would have dudes that were like, 2 out of 10. I'm the king of the world. I'm running tomorrow. And she'd be like, maybe clear up that DUI first. Like, this is not your moment, guy. And I think this is just it's a nature, nurture, whatever. I'm not going to solve that question. But it's a big difference between the way that we operate. So part of it is just getting in there and doing it and taking those risks. Make sure that you have your squad there. Make sure that you have the support that you need. I think personally and professionally, and spend time with other entrepreneurs. I don't know what I would do without other entrepreneurs. And over the last decade, it's been a weird shift in terms of my closest friends, and a lot of them run businesses, and We encourage each other, we support each other, we tell each other when we're being idiots. And that type of feedback is incredibly important. You want to be able to talk to someone who can say, actually, we tried that, here's what happened, here's what I might do differently if I could do it again, and here's where your context might be different. And so having those conversations is hugely important. There are incredible online communities, but not everything needs to be formal. So I act as a mentor for the Crypto Chicks Hatchery. I absolutely love doing that. Mentorship doesn't need to be a formal program where we're sitting down and having a particular meeting at a designated time. If you have questions that you've always wanted to ask someone who's a founder or an author or is doing something that you really admire, them an email. I think it's going to probably be shocking how often you get a response. Provided that it's not a question like, I'm thinking about AML, what should I do with my career? I'm not going to answer those. I love you, I'm sorry. I just, I don't have time to answer those. But if you have really, really directed questions about how someone did something, you know, about specific things, those are the types of questions that people tend to answer. They're not going to do the thing for you, but most of us are happy to talk about the things that we know well in our own journeys.
Yeah, that's fair. Could you talk a little bit about the experience then of female founders in the hatchery? So you've obviously worked with them and given support and mentoring. You've done some sessions, which we talked about prior. You know, if somebody's considering doing something like that, could you kind of walk them through what that might look like?
Sure. I think one of the really cool things in this space is there's so many grants, there are so many hackathons, there are so many opportunities to start to develop your idea. And those are really good testing grounds initially to be able to get there and bring a team together and say, maybe we'll take home some prize money, but no matter what, we'll have spent some really intensive time workshopping our idea and playing with the code and starting to build it and starting to get some feedback from the judges and from the mentors and the people that are participating in that hackathon. Hatchery takes it a step beyond that. So most of those ideas have started off in the context of a hackathon, and the people that become founders have decided, you know what, I think there's a real business there. I think this is solving a real world problem, and I want to work on this. I want to develop this, and some of those turn into companies.
That's an interesting journey. Okay, so I had a few lists of questions for advice for female founders. So if somebody has an idea that they want to take forward, do you have any thoughts on do's and don'ts?
Always know what problem you're solving. This is my number one question for founders, and even when we have companies that come to us as Outlier that say, I need compliance advice, my first question isn't, you know, your investor deck or your elevator pitch. I'll ask people, what problem are you solving? And if you can't tell me what problem you're solving, you probably don't have a business. And this is one of those situations where I won't send someone a formal compliance proposal. I will, just as a human being, spend some time talking with them to say, what is it that you want to do, and where do you think you want to go? And are you sure you want to go into a highly regulated area? And that's really where your desire is, where your motivation is. And sometimes the answer is yes, by the way. I've had folks revamp things and come back to me with something that's incredible that they've built. And it's really good. So I will not pretend at all that I have any prescience about the type of businesses that will make it or not, but I can help you strengthen your ideas about what it is you want to do. I think also it's really important to be relentless, which isn't to say don't learn from your mistakes. Always learn from your mistakes, but you will get knocked down. You will get discouraged. Nobody talks about that with being a founder, but most businesses fail, which is awful. It's an awful statistic. And every year that you succeed is a middle finger to that statistic, and it feels great. And you want to achieve that, but you'll never achieve that if you don't get up again when you get knocked down. And you will get knocked down. You will have hard, horrible days, and you will cry, and it will feel awful. Get back up, learn from whatever went wrong, and do it all over again.
I love that. It's funny actually, because I agree. The founders that I talk to, they say to me, in one day, they can have the best day and the worst day of their life. Like, sun up, something good happens, and like, yay. And by the end of the day, they're just like, oh my God. So true. So, so true. Do you have any
It's
tips on that point, actually, about how you maintain your relentlessness? So, when you get knocked down and you're like on the floor crying, you're like, I can't do this anymore. Is there some methodology that you use to get through those moments?
I think for me, it's that when it feels bad, I try not to beat myself up. Um, when there's a bad day, I will let myself, whine and eat some cherry Garcia ice cream and just take my dog for a long walk and not do anything else that evening, with the promise to myself that the next day when I get up, I am getting up on problem solving mode. And so I'll let myself feel all the feelings. I'll have a couple hours that are about feelings. And then the next day, I'm going to put those away and I'm going to tactically work on solving whatever the problem is, because the problem is probably not about my feelings. The problem is about an actual thing that I need to work on in some capacity.
Excellent advice. Okay, that's a good list. So that was two do's. Is there any others that you want to throw out there?
I think is it okay with you if I go on a little Banky rant for a minute?
Yeah, do it.
So I think for people in crypto assets, for people in Web3, understanding the traditional finance context and the traditional finance way of thinking about things cannot be understated. For companies that are dealing in virtual assets in Canada, the biggest barrier to entry is not compliance, it's not legal, it's not any of those things, it's access to basic banking, which you're not afforded a right to as a business. And so those on-off ramps between crypto assets and fiat end up being an immense challenge. You see things that happen still where there'll be companies that get de-risked. So that's a polite way of saying we close your account and send you on your way with no further business with us by their banks, because they have the audacity to have the word blockchain in their name, even if they're not doing something that's a regulated financial business. And so understanding that context is really important. Those are things that can really have a huge negative impact on a business at exactly the wrong point, like right before your planned launch date. And so really understanding that context, understanding how to talk about risk, making sure that you have backups in terms of your interaction with the traditional fiat financial system is incredibly important, cannot be understated.
That's really, really good advice. The other thing as well, actually, we touched on it a little bit when you were talking about the Bitcoin Bay meetup and the guy with the pension fund, the pension, his grandparents' access to his grandparents' pension. But as a business founder, are there any particular risks and scams that you think Web3 founders should be aware of?
Unfortunately, there are so many, and I would say don't trust, verify. I think also it's really important not to be fooled by the hype. And so it's easy to get sucked in when someone looks flashy and successful. It's easy to get sucked in when they're promising you a lot of things. We have a running joke on our team, so we tend to call Lamborghinis scambos. In that if I see a branded Lamborghini outside of someone's event, I'm like, oh, I wonder if that's an exit scam. Immediately, in that I've seen it happen so much where people are just pulled in by these, these displays of auspicious wealth and things like that. Those things end up being problematic. When you have people that are talking to you about maybe investing in your company, about investing in your ideas, do due diligence on them. This is not a one-way street. You want to know, that the money will actually come to you, so that this is someone that actually does have wealth, or the type of company that actually does invest in other companies. And I think as part of that, you want to know that this is money that's not coming from criminal origins. So we famously in Canada had the breakdown of the Quadriga exchange, and one of its original founders was a guy named Omar Dinani, who changed his name to Michael Petrin. who after that, so even after all this blew up, continued to have a business that, according to his LinkedIn, invests in crypto businesses. And I think this is a convicted fraudster, money launderer, what have you. And so I think these are things that you have to be aware of. Where is that money coming from? What's behind it? And what might they ask of you eventually? And if something is too good to be true, unfortunately, it probably is.
That's good advice. One of the things I guess that you must have a very good insight into as well is the trajectory of regulation. Can't speak today. Trajectory of regulation, and how that might impact certain business strategies or roadmaps. So, like one thing, I mean, I'm sort of dating the podcast now by saying this, but with what's going on with Coinbase at the moment, where there was an insider who was allegedly front running some of the coins that they were listing on the exchange, for instance, and that's thrown up a whole discussion in the US now around, if SEC goes after Coinbase, have they been listing unregistered securities, etc., etc. So these are kind of risks that I feel like businesses, because the regulatory environment is a little bit hazy still, businesses in this space have to think about that. Are there any trends that you think a Web3 founder should be very hyper aware of in that context going forward in the coming months and years?
So for what it's worth, I don't know anyone who was involved in the Coinbase piece, as far as I know, but I can guess in my head how that went down. And there was probably a conversation that happened somewhere in the background, possibly with that person and a lawyer that they know, to say like, yeah, but the stuff that we're doing, is it a security? Is there any jurisdiction over this? And that assumption, that idea that something is new, ergo regulators can't touch it, ergo these existing rules about conduct don't apply, that doesn't fly. We've seen this happen time and time again, where in some cases companies have gotten actual written legal opinions that says like, oh, sure, you can do trading in this way because it's not a security, and that ends up being problematic in the end. And so I think there's part of that where, sure, you could make a tenuous legal argument, maybe, that this is okay or that this isn't covered activity. But is it the right thing to do? Is it worth that giant reputational kick in the ass? And the answer is that it's probably not. It's probably not worth it to be seen as a company that's dealing with scandals, and a company that is front-running customers, that's treating customers unfairly, that's dumping on retail, that's participating in something that's a pump and dump. So any of those types of ideas are things that are really bad from a reputation perspective. And reputations are hard to build. If you've built a company that has a good reputation, you just don't want to let those kind of shenanigans interfere with it. And I think that has to be part of the culture, and it has to be part of the culture from day one. This idea that it's not about pulling one over on the regulator, it's about building a good, strong, lasting company. And you want your employees to be bought into protecting that reputation as much as you are.
Yeah, that's good advice. Okay, so what else? We've touched on that. The other question I wanted to ask is what good networks there would be to join for female founders. So we've obviously talked a bit about crypto chicks, and they've obviously got Metis DAO, or metis.io, I think is their website. So that's one resource that women could go to. This doesn't necessarily have to be Canada focused. I know you've probably got like more kind of a deeper network here, but do you have any suggestions of meetup groups or any kind of projects or networks that women could leverage to launch their businesses?
Absolutely. So I would say don't necessarily just focus on women-only networks, although Haley Lennon has a really fantastic crypto-focused and I think US-based networking group, that the name of which I'm blanking on, but I'm sure it's attached to her Twitter profile. And she's one of my favorite crypto lawyers in the US. But go to groups like the Bitcoin Bay. Go to groups. If you go on meetup.com or Eventbrite or any of those sites, you can just enter as a search term Web3 or or crypto or Bitcoin and find the groups that are of interest to you. The other piece that I will say about that is don't hesitate to stop going to things that don't work for you. That's okay. So if you go and it's not that's fine. But test out the ones that are in your area. There's so much happening both in person now and online. There's also really great industry organizations. So if you're doing something that would be something like an exchange type business or something that would be considered a money service business in Canada, the Canadian MSB Association is an absolutely fantastic organization. They do training, they do conferences, and it's a great opportunity to network with other entrepreneurs. The Canadian Blockchain Consortium is absolutely incredible. They have a number of different committees and any of these organizations, by the way, so any industry organization is looking for volunteers to do things. They are looking for people to get in to help with events. Helping with events, as even if you're not an events person, being the person who's at the table and helping to check people in can be one of the most amazing opportunities to meet all of the people that are operating in that space. And so even though that might sound like a really mundane job, it's absolutely something that can put you face to face with a bunch of members of those communities. And so get involved. I am pretty talkative, but I would consider myself a shy person by nature. And so I think that's one of those strategies. If you're not particularly inclined to just walk around and and put your hand up and say, hi, I'm so and so, at least having those interactions and having those good friendly interactions are great opportunities. We have the Futurist conference that's coming up in Toronto in a couple of weeks, and that is going to be an absolutely fantastic opportunity to meet so many different companies in this space and see different projects that are happening. And I think as part of that, if you're a budding entrepreneur, if you're thinking through what your value proposition is going to be and what your competitive landscape is like, you want to go to those places, you want to walk around, you want to ask, is anyone else doing this and what's working and what's not, and you want to check out that competition, so to speak.
That's fantastic advice. And one last question then is funding. So the all-important funding, and I know you said that you'd done a workshop, I think, for Crypto Chicks on this particular topic, if I'm not mistaken. Did you have any thoughts or suggestions about that for founders as to how they can kick off that for their projects?
Don't take any shit. So I've bootstrapped. I've never taken funding, and that is partly because at no point have I ever wanted to relinquish control. And I think you really have to understand that trade-off at the point that you're thinking about raising. So what are we going to use the funding for? How much control are we giving up? And I think even just talking about this as an investor with the companies that I've supported, part of what makes me want to invest in a company is a coachable founder. And so when I'm having conversations with people that are looking for funding, I'm looking for a good idea. I'm looking for a path to revenue. So I'm looking for something that's going to be revenue generating. I want something that makes sense. I want something that I think is likely to be profitable. But someone can have a fantastic idea. But if they're not interested in a conversation, I am probably not interested as an investor. And this is a big deal to me as a compliance nerd, because as soon as I'm invested in a company, I care if they're doing the right thing from a compliance perspective until I stop being invested in that company. And if I've invested in a pre-seed phase, I understand that that's time measurable in years, maybe decades. And so you want there to be that relationship, and you want to look for investors that want that relationship with you, that will give you advice, that will make introductions to their network. I think that's incredibly important. So it's more than just a financial transaction, and I think understanding that when you're fundraising is incredibly important. We also in Canada have a lot of really great investment networks, and so I think if you're thinking about fundraising, starting to figure out where those are, whether it's things like the Golden Triangle Angel Network in Waterloo. We've got a bunch of investor networks in Toronto. And start talking to people in your network that are part of those investor networks and ask them what they're looking for and what's important to them, and starting to figure out which ones are the right fit for what you're doing.
Good advice. All right. Well, I think that's a ton of information for people to act on. So thank you so much for sharing your journey, but then also all of the good learnings and advice, for aspiring female founders out there. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been fascinating.
Thank you for putting this together and for inviting me to be part of this. It's been absolutely fantastic.
My pleasure.